Mars has always felt like the most dangerous kind of promise. It is close enough to see as a world, not just a point of light. Close enough to imagine planes, horizons, weather, and even footsteps. For more than a century, people have looked at that reddish disk and sensed something almost familiar in it, as if the solar system were quietly offering us a second chance. And yet, every serious look at Mars has revealed the same unsettling truth. The planet resembles Earth just enough to tempt us, and differs from it just enough to punish every false assumption. So if Mars seems like the obvious place for humanity's first true colony, why are we still so far from making one? Ever since human beings realised that Mars shares at least some broad similarities with our own planet, our imagination has had a hard time letting go of it. Here was another world with seasons, polar ice, canyons, volcanoes, dust storms, and a day length surprisingly close to our own. It was not difficult to see why generations of astronomers, writers, and dreamers treated Mars as more than a neighbouring planet. It became a mirror for our hopes, our fears, and our need to believe that life might not be confined to one fragile sphere. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that fascination surged into something even stranger. Some observers, looking with far more limited instruments than we possess today, believed Mars might show signs of intelligent design. The idea of canals, of a fading civilization, of a world that had once been alive in ways not entirely unlike our own, captured the public mood. It sounds quaint now, maybe even naive, but it was not born from stupidity. It was born from a very human habit. When we see patterns at the edge of understanding, we fill the gaps with stories. Even now, after spacecraft, orbiters, landers, and rovers have replaced the blurred telescopic guesses of earlier centuries, Mars still encourages that instinct. We no longer imagine ancient engineers carving canals across its deserts, but we do ask whether life might once have existed there in microbial form. We ask whether rivers once flowed across its surface. We ask whether seas once pooled in basins now left dry and bitter. And once those questions are asked, another one rises naturally behind them. If life could once begin there, or if conditions there once resembled those on early Earth, could humans one day go there and stay? That question has only grown more serious with every mission we send. Robotic explorers have transformed Mars from an abstract destination into a place with texture and evidence. The rovers that crossed its ground did more than collect data. They made Mars feel real. They rolled over ancient sediments, studied rocks shaped by vanished water, and showed us landscapes that looked uncannily like the dry bones of a once dynamic planet. Their journeys changed the tone of the conversation. Mars stopped being merely a science fiction setting and became a logistical problem waiting to be solved. That is why the idea of colonizing Mars no longer lives only in novels and films. Space agencies have studied it. Private companies have marketed it. Organizations devoted to the long-term future of human settlement beyond Earth have placed Mars at the center of their vision. To many people, it now feels less like fantasy and more like an unfinished project. The red planet sits there, almost accusingly, as if daring us to admit that our ambition has outrun our current ability. And that is where the real story begins. Because the greatest obstacle to colonizing Mars is not a lack of desire. If anything, desire is the one thing we already have in abundance. The deeper problem is that Mars presents a long chain of challenges, each one feeding into the next, each one easy to underestimate when viewed in isolation. Distance becomes radiation. Radiation becomes engineering. Engineering becomes mass. Mass becomes cost. Delay becomes autonomy. Shelter becomes excavation. Survival becomes psychology. And all the while, the planet itself remains indifferent. The first misconception is that Mars is close. In astronomy it is. In human terms, it is not. Under the most favourable launch conditions, a crewed journey could take on the order of 3 months. At first glance, that may not sound overwhelming. People have crossed oceans for longer. Crews have endured long deployments in cramped and stressful conditions before. But this comparison breaks down the moment you remember what exists between Earth and Mars. It is not just empty distance, it is unprotected distance. For at least 100 days, and possibly longer, depending on mission design, astronauts would be travelling outside the protective reach of Earth's magnetic field. Here on our own planet, we live inside layers of defence so constant that we hardly notice them. Our magnetosphere helps divert many of the most dangerous charged particles streaming through space. Our atmosphere absorbs and scatters much of what gets through. Together they create a shield so effective that life on the ground can go about its business with little sense of the violence being deflected overhead. Once you leave that shelter, the universe becomes harsher very quickly. Astronauts on the way to Mars would be exposed to solar wind, bursts of energetic particles from the sun, and cosmic radiation arriving from far more distant events. Some of those particles were accelerated by catastrophes that happened long before human civilization ever began. They can pass through flesh, disrupt cells, damage DNA, and increase the risk of cancers and neurological problems. A Mars mission is not just a matter of keeping people alive in a mechanical sense. It is a matter of limiting how much invisible damage they accumulate simply by being there. This is one reason Mars colonization remains so difficult to speak about honestly. It forces us to confront a very unromantic truth. Space is not empty in any safe or peaceful sense. It is full of things that can hurt you, and some of the most dangerous of them cannot be seen, smelled, heard, or easily stopped. That makes the design of a Mars transport vehicle far more complicated than a spacecraft that merely reaches orbit and returns. There are ideas for reducing the danger. One possibility is to build protection directly into the ship, using materials rich in hydrogen, because hydrogen is particularly useful in blocking certain forms of radiation. Water, being rich in hydrogen, becomes more than a life support necessity. It becomes a potential shield. You can imagine spacecraft walls lined with water storage, turning a resource the crew already needs into a passive layer of defense. Other concepts go further and imagine generating an artificial magnetic field around the craft, a miniature imitation of what Earth already does naturally. But that would require immense power, compact reactors, and a degree of reliability we are not yet comfortable trusting with human lives. And even if that technical problem was solved, the journey would still impose another kind of isolation, one that is easier to explain but harder to emotionally grasp. Communication with Earth would no longer happen in anything like real time. Depending on where the planets are in their orbits, a signal could take anywhere from a few minutes to more than 20 minutes to travel one way. That means a round-trip exchange could be delayed by 6 minutes at best, and much longer at worst. A normal conversation becomes impossible, a sudden emergency becomes lonelier, remote control becomes far less useful. Advice can still be sent, instructions can still be recorded, but immediate help cannot arrive through a screen. That matters because so much of modern life depends on the illusion of instant support. On Earth, we live in a world where expertise can be reached immediately. Someone somewhere can answer the call. Someone can talk you through the failure. Someone can watch your telemetry in real time and tell you what to do next. On Mars, settlers would have to think more like sailors once did when they lost sight of land, only with higher stakes and no breathable air outside. The moment something goes wrong, they would belong to the problem before they belonged to any rescue plan. This begins to change how we should think about colonization itself. A Mars colony is not simply a base placed on another world. It is a system that must absorb delay, danger, uncertainty, and failure without collapsing. It must be built for a kind of independence that few human settlements have ever truly required. That is why every discussion about Mars eventually expands beyond rockets. Transportation is only the first gate. The real challenge begins after arrival, when a crew must do more than survive a landing. They must transform a hostile landscape into a place where life can continue day after day, without constant rescue from Earth. And yet, for all this, Mars remains the most plausible place to try. That is what makes it so fascinating. It is not easy, but it is imaginable. It is deadly, but not absurdly out of reach. It contains water locked in ice. It offers ground that can be used for shielding. It has gravity, though weaker than Earth's, and a day that still resembles a human rhythm more than the endless light and darkness of many other worlds. In the cruel arithmetic of the solar system, these are extraordinary gifts. The trouble is that gifts on Mars arrive entangled with penalties. Water is there, but often frozen, buried, or trapped in places that complicate settlement. Shelter is possible, but not ready-made. The surface is accessible, but drenched in radiation and exposed to a thin atmosphere that offers little protection. The planet invites us just enough to keep the dream alive, then quietly reminds us that wanting to live there and being able to live there are not remotely the same thing. That is why the question is not really whether Mars can be reached. It can. Nor is the question whether a human crew could survive there for a limited period, with enough equipment and support. They probably could. The real question is whether we can create something more durable than a visit, whether we can build a settlement that does not feel like a prolonged emergency, whether we can stop thinking like explorers passing through and start thinking like a species trying to take root in alien ground. Because the closer you look, the less Mars resembles a simple destination, and the more it resembles an engineering trial, a medical gamble, and a psychological test woven together. Before a single permanent colony can exist, we have to decide where such a settlement would even go, what trade-offs we would accept, and what kind of world we are really choosing when we say we want to live on Mars at all. That choice begins with the journey itself, because the trip to Mars is not just a transfer between planets. It is the first environment of the colony, the first place where every weakness in the plan reveals itself, and the first place where the human body begins to understand that it has left the only world it was ever built for. A launch from Earth is violent but brief. A voyage to Mars is something else entirely. Once the engines have done their work and Earth begins to shrink behind the spacecraft, the mission enters a long middle state that is easy to describe in diagrams and much harder to imagine as lived experience. The crew is no longer on Earth, but they are not yet on Mars. They are suspended between two worlds, carrying a sealed pocket of artificial life through a region of space that is actively hostile to them. It is tempting to think of this in familiar terms: a long sea voyage, a submarine patrol, a remote research station, but none of those comparisons fully holds. On a ship at sea, there is still air outside. On a submarine, you remain within the protective envelope of Earth. At an Antarctic station, if conditions become severe enough, rescue may be difficult, but the people there are still standing on their home planet. A Mars crew has none of those comforts. Their ship is not merely transport. It is atmosphere, shelter, medicine, insulation, food system, radiation mitigation, communications hub, and psychological refuge all at once. If something essential fails, there is no outside to step into and no nearby port to reach. That reality changes the way mission planners have to think. On short flights in low Earth orbit, spacecraft can be optimized around quick return. Risk can be tolerated differently because the crew remains relatively close to home. A Mars mission does not have that luxury. Every system must endure for months, and every failure must be survivable without immediate resupply. The crew must become not just passengers, but custodians of a tiny artificial ecosystem that has to keep functioning in a vacuum. One of the most difficult threats during this time is radiation. It is easy to underestimate because it does not announce itself dramatically. There is no crack in the hull, no roar of fire, no visible wave advancing through the cabin. And yet it may be the most important reason why a simple Mars colony remains out of reach. During the trip, astronauts would be exposed to energetic particles from the Sun and to galactic cosmic rays arriving from events far beyond our solar system. These are not minor irritants. They can pass through the human body and damage it at the cellular level. They can alter DNA, increase long-term cancer risk, and possibly affect the nervous system in ways we still do not fully understand. The danger comes in layers. Solar radiation can surge during outbursts from the Sun, including solar flares and coronal mass ejections. A spacecraft may be able to ride out ordinary conditions with passive shielding, but a major solar event raises the stakes immediately. Then there are galactic cosmic rays, which are even more insidious. They arrive not from our own star, but from extremely energetic events elsewhere in the galaxy, carrying enough energy that shielding them completely is extraordinarily difficult. It is one thing to keep out weather, it is another to keep out a form of invisible shrapnel that can pass through matter with alarming ease. That is why so much thought has gone into what kind of materials should surround a crew cabin. Dense metals are not always the ideal answer. In some cases, materials rich in hydrogen are more useful because they help absorb and slow incoming particles without producing as much secondary radiation. Water becomes especially attractive for this reason, a resource already needed for drinking, hygiene, food preparation, and oxygen production can also serve as a protective layer if arranged intelligently around the living spaces. Some designs imagine placing water tanks around a storm shelter area, creating a safer compartment for the crew during intense solar events. It is not a perfect answer, but it shows the kind of thinking Mars travel demands. Every kilogram has to do more than one job. This is one of the fundamental barriers to colonizing Mars. The problem is not just that radiation exists, it is that protection from radiation adds mass, and mass is one of the most expensive things in spaceflight. The more shielding you add, the heavier the spacecraft becomes. The heavier the spacecraft becomes, the more propulsion you need. The more propulsion you need, the more fuel you carry. The more fuel you carry, the larger and more complex the mission becomes. A threat that begins at the level of atomic particles eventually reshapes the entire architecture of the spacecraft. That architecture must also account for something far more intimate than shielding. It must account for human life in confinement. A Mars voyage may last around 3 months under favourable conditions, but favourable does not mean comfortable. The crew would be living in limited space, surrounded by the same walls, the same sounds, the same routines, and the same faces for the duration. Privacy would be scarce. Silence might be rare. Even simple bodily rhythms become strange when gravity is removed from the equation. Weightlessness is often presented as one of the delights of spaceflight, and for a brief time it probably is, but over months it becomes a medical burden. The human body is built for a world where every movement is negotiated with gravity. Remove that constant resistance and muscle begins to waste away. Bone density declines, fluids redistribute upward, contributing to puffiness in the face and pressure changes that may affect vision. Balance systems become confused, cardiovascular conditioning deteriorates. Even a crew that arrives at Mars outwardly healthy may arrive physically diminished by the very trip that brought them there. This means exercise is not optional. It becomes part of the maintenance schedule of the human body, as necessary as checking filters or monitoring oxygen levels. In a Mars transport craft, the crew would need exercise equipment and time set aside each day to use it. That sounds straightforward, until you remember that every hour spent preserving the crew is an hour not spent on other tasks, and every machine required for exercise adds complexity and mass to the spacecraft. Again, the challenges do not stay in their lane, they stack on top of one another. And then there is food. A 3-month journey for a crew is not impossible to provision, but it is not trivial either. Food must remain stable, safe, and nutritious in a confined environment for the entire voyage. It must generate minimal waste, require manageable storage, and ideally provide some variety so the crew does not sink into a demoralizing monotony. On Earth, food is easy to take for granted because it is woven into culture, comfort, and spontaneity. In deep space, food becomes logistics and psychology at once. It must sustain the body, but it also has to help sustain morale. Water, too, takes on a new character. On a Mars mission, water is not just something you drink. It is a recyclable asset, a shielding material, a source of oxygen through electrolysis, and part of the overall thermal and life support balance of the ship. Waste streams that would seem unpleasant to think about on Earth become precious sources of recoverable material. The voyage begins to blur the distinction between clean and unclean, between consumption and recovery. The spacecraft becomes a closed-loop system in which survival depends on learning to treat almost nothing as disposable. All of this would be challenging enough if the crew could remain in constant contact with mission control. But distance imposes another kind of discipline. Communication delays with Mars are not an inconvenience in the ordinary sense. They are a structural break in how humans normally solve problems together. Even at the best of times, signals take minutes to travel one way. At worse alignments, the delay becomes far longer. A conversation becomes a sequence of recorded thoughts. Advice can still be given, but not in time to catch a mistake as it unfolds. This has major consequences for the psychology of command. On many missions in Earth orbit, ground teams can monitor conditions in real time and advise or direct astronauts almost instantly. A Mars crew cannot depend on that level of oversight. They must be trained not only to carry out procedures, but to diagnose novel situations, improvise responsibly, and make decisions under uncertainty without waiting for permission. In effect, the journey to Mars forces a spacecraft crew to become more like the first crews who crossed unknown oceans than the astronauts we often imagine being guided continuously from home. That autonomy is necessary, but it is also a burden. Decision-making under stress is exhausting. Doing it in a sealed vessel, with the knowledge that your choices may shape whether the mission reaches Mars at all, adds a level of pressure that is hard to simulate. Emergencies would feel more absolute. A warning light is not merely a technical problem. It is a reminder that the people best equipped to help are separated from you by millions of kilometers and the finite speed of light. This is where the dream of colonizing Mars begins to reveal its true character. We often imagine the great challenge as being the landing itself, the first footprint, the first habitat inflated against the red horizon. But the colony begins much earlier than that. It begins when human beings accept that for months they will live inside a machine that must function as a miniature world. By the time they see Mars growing larger in the windows, they will already have been living the logic of colonization. They will have been rehearsing independence, fragility, discipline, and constrained survival every day of the trip. And yet, after all these dangers, after the radiation, the confinements, the weakening of the body, the long delays in communication, and the relentless burden of self-maintenance, the spacecraft still has to do one more thing. It has to arrive at Mars, carrying a crew healthy enough, alert enough, and strong enough to begin building a life on the surface. That requirement changes how we should think about arrival. Reaching Mars is not the finish line, it is the moment when a partially worn-down human crew must step into an even harsher environment and make irreversible choices about where to begin. Because once they are there, the next question becomes unavoidable. On a planet with frozen water, buried ice, thin air, dangerous radiation, and terrain that can help or kill depending on where you land, where could a real settlement possibly be placed? That question sounds simple until you try to answer it with any seriousness. Because on Mars, there is no perfect site, only combinations of advantage and compromise. A future settlement would not begin where the scenery is most beautiful or where the romance of exploration feels strongest. It would begin where several brutal necessities overlap just enough to give human life a fighting chance. The first of those necessities is water. On Mars, water is not merely useful, it is the foundation beneath almost every other plan. People need it to drink, to grow food, to produce oxygen, and potentially to make fuel. Without access to water, a settlement would remain permanently dependent on shipments from Earth, and the economics of that would become punishing very quickly. So any serious discussion of a Martian colony has to begin not with domes or rockets, but with ice. That is why the polar regions immediately attract attention. Mars has ice caps, and on first inspection that seems promising. Water is there in abundance compared with many other parts of the planet. But then the drawbacks begin to emerge. The poles are cold even by Martian standards. They are poorly positioned for efficient solar power at certain times. Their seasonal lighting can complicate operations, and although cold itself can be managed if you have enough energy and insulation, every added environmental burden increases the overall fragility of the colony. A site rich in ice, but starved of operational convenience, may not be as attractive as it first appears. This is where the problem becomes interesting. Mission planners are not only looking for water, they are looking for water in forms that can be reached, extracted, and integrated into a wider support system. One compelling possibility lies in craters where temperatures remain low enough for ice deposits to persist. Some of these areas may hold large quantities of frozen water. In theory, a colony built near such a deposit would have a local source of one of its most essential resources. But again, access matters. A resource trapped in difficult terrain or buried beneath material that is expensive to remove is not the same thing as a resource ready to be used. There is also the prospect of underground water bound up in permafrost beneath the Martian surface. Data from orbiters has suggested that water is not confined to the poles alone. It may be distributed below ground in many places across the planet. That possibility changes the strategic picture dramatically because it opens the door to settlement at lower latitudes, where conditions are somewhat milder and sunlight is more favourable for power generation. Instead of forcing colonists into the harshest cold simply to remain close to ice, it may allow them to choose sites with a better overall balance of resources and operational ease. And balance is everything on Mars. If water were the only factor, the answer might already be obvious. But a landing site must also make sense aerodynamically. Mars has an atmosphere, but it is a very thin one. Too thin to protect human beings, yet thick enough to matter when landing spacecraft. A vehicle descending to the surface must slow itself using whatever atmosphere exists, and that means elevation matters. Lower-lying regions have slightly thicker air above them than highland areas do, making them more favourable for entry and descent. The northern hemisphere of Mars includes broad lowlands that therefore become attractive for a very practical reason. They give landing systems more atmosphere to work with, and on Mars, even a little extra atmosphere is valuable. This is one of those details that reveals how colonization differs from fantasy. In stories, a base appears wherever the narrative needs it. In reality, the colony may be forced into certain regions before the first habitat is even designed, simply because those are the safest places to land repeatedly. A Martian settlement cannot exist as a single heroic arrival. It has to receive multiple cargo missions, construction equipment, spare parts, and additional crew over time. So the first site must be chosen not just for one landing, but for a pattern of landings that can continue for years. That leads to a second crucial resource beyond water and atmosphere: energy. A settlement on Mars must generate power continuously, or near continuously, for life support, heating, communications, extraction equipment, processing machinery, environmental control, and later, agriculture. Solar panels are an obvious candidate, especially in regions where sunlight is more available and where temperatures are somewhat less punishing than at the poles. But solar power alone can become unreliable, especially when one of the defining features of Mars is the planet-wide dust storm. Dust on Mars is not a minor inconvenience. It is fine, pervasive, electrostatic, and capable of darkening the sky over huge distances. During severe storms, sunlight drops dramatically, and solar output can become dangerously low. That means a settlement relying too heavily on solar panels may discover that one of the things Mars does best is turn its most convenient power source against it. So a good settlement site must think ahead. It must ask not only where the light is strongest, but how a colony will continue functioning when that light fades under weeks of drifting dust. Warmth also matters, though in a limited and relative sense. There are no truly warm parts of Mars in any Earth-like way, but equatorial and mid-latitude regions are still less hostile than the deep cold of the poles. A site that reduces the thermal burden even slightly may save substantial energy over time. That can translate into smaller heating demands, less wear on systems, and a more stable operating environment. Again, the colony is not searching for comfort, it is searching for the least punishing version of survival. Then there is topography. Flat, open ground helps with landing and construction, but Mars offers another geographic possibility that may prove even more important in the long term: lava tubes. These are long subterranean tunnels formed in ancient volcanic regions, where flowing magma once hollowed out pathways that later remained after the liquid rock drained away. On Earth, lava tubes exist on a modest scale. On Mars, where gravity is lower and volcanic history is immense, some scientists suspect they may be enormous. Large enough, perhaps, to shelter whole structures inside them. That possibility is difficult to overstate. A lava tube could offer what the open surface does not: natural shielding from radiation, stable internal temperatures compared with the exposed surface, protection from micrometeorite impacts, shelter from dust and from the daily thermal extremes that plague anything left outside. For a species trying to survive on Mars, a cave is not merely a geological curiosity. It is the nearest thing the planet offers to free architecture. But of course, even here the pattern repeats. A lava tube is only useful if it can be reached, mapped, entered and adapted safely. A tunnel that collapses, narrows unpredictably, or lies far from water and favourable landing zones may not help much. So the ideal site begins to look less like a single feature and more like a rare overlap. Accessible water, manageable terrain, lower elevation, decent sunlight, possible subsurface shelter, and enough room for repeated landing operations. The more you list these requirements, the more obvious it becomes why no obvious settlement has already been chosen. Mars may contain many promising ingredients, but it does not present them in simple, convenient clusters. This is also why the first phase of colonization will almost certainly belong to machines. Long before the first permanent settlers arrive, precursor missions would have to survey candidate sites in much greater detail than orbiters alone can provide. They would need to verify the location and purity of ice deposits, measure how difficult the ground is to excavate, assess slope stability, inspect the local dust environment, and perhaps map nearby subsurface voids. They would also have to begin preparing the site, because on Mars, the time between arrival and survival cannot be left entirely to human hands. Not everything a colony needs can fit inside one ship, and even if it could, unpacking and assembling it in spacesuits under Martian conditions would be slow, exhausting, and dangerous. That means cargo missions would have to arrive ahead of the crew. Some would bring power systems, some would bring construction equipment, some would bring life support components, communications hardware, spare parts, and perhaps pressurized mobile shelters. The site would have to become at least partially functional before the first long-stay colonists stepped onto the surface. In that sense, the settlement would begin as a robotic outpost and only later become a human one. This changes the emotional shape of the whole endeavour. We often picture Mars colonization beginning with people. In reality, it is more likely to begin with autonomous preparation, with machines laying down the first fragile layer of infrastructure in silence. They may grade terrain, unload materials, position power systems, and begin constructing or covering habitats. By the time humans arrive, the real miracle would not be the landing itself. It would be that the planet had already been persuaded, however slightly, to accommodate life. Even then, the first settlers would not step into a finished colony. They would enter an unfinished system. Power would still need to be connected. Equipment would still need to be checked. Temporary living spaces might remain cramped and provisional. If permanent habitats were being assembled or printed on site, the crew may have to spend weeks or months operating from limited shelters while bringing the rest of the settlement online. Mars would not greet them with a home, it would greet them with a work site. And this is perhaps the clearest answer to why choosing a site matters so much. The colony will only ever be as resilient as the logic of its location. If it is too far from water, every day becomes more dependent on imported mass. If it lies in terrain too difficult to expand, growth becomes costly and dangerous. If it lacks natural shelter, more engineering must compensate. If dust or power constraints dominate the area, the settlement becomes more brittle than it can afford to be. The site is not just where the colony starts, it is the set of long-term conditions that will quietly govern every decision afterward. So when people ask where humans might settle on Mars, the honest answer is that we are looking for the least bad place on an uncompromising planet. A place where water can be reached, ships can land, power can be generated, and perhaps the ground itself offers some chance of shelter. The first colony will not be placed where Mars is welcoming. It will be placed where Mars is merely survivable enough to justify the attempt. And once that place is chosen, the next challenge becomes even more daunting, because a location alone does nothing to keep people alive. A bare patch of regolith, however well selected, is still just exposed ground under a thin, toxic sky. To turn that into a home, we would have to build shelter before life could even properly begin. That is where the dream becomes brutally physical, because a Martian settlement cannot begin with people wandering out onto the surface and simply assembling a town the way pioneers once did on Earth. Mars does not allow that kind of improvisation. Before a community can exist, before routine can exist, before even a tolerable version of daily life can exist, something much more basic has to be created first. A shielded volume of pressurized air. A place where human tissue is not immediately in conflict with the surrounding world. On Earth, we almost never think about buildings in such absolute terms. A house protects us from weather, from cold, from heat, from inconvenience. On Mars, a habitat would protect us from death. That difference changes everything. A Martian habitat is not just architecture, it is a survival machine. Its walls are not merely boundaries between indoors and outdoors, they are the line between biology and vacuum, between functioning life support and a landscape that offers none of the chemistry human beings require. This is why the first permanent structures on Mars would almost certainly have to be prepared before large numbers of settlers arrive. Human beings in spacesuits can do extraordinary things, but they are not efficient construction workers in an exposed environment. Every movement in a suit costs effort. Dexterity is limited, visibility is reduced, fatigue accumulates quickly. Tasks that would seem almost trivial on Earth become exhausting when every motion is filtered through protective layers, gloves, pressure systems, and the constant awareness that the environment is trying to kill you. That makes heavy manual construction not just slow, but deeply impractical. So the early work would fall to robots. Autonomous or semi-autonomous machines would need to begin the transformation of a site before humans came to inhabit it. That may mean unloading cargo landers, moving materials, excavating surface soil, levelling the ground, positioning equipment, and then beginning the long process of creating actual shelter. In this sense, the first builders of Mars are unlikely to be astronauts planting flags. They are more likely to be machines, performing repetitive, patient, unglamorous labour under a dusty salmon sky. There have already been many design proposals for what a Martian habitat might look like. Some are elegant, some imaginative, some almost organic in their shapes. A few imagine structures made from ice, others explore fungal or biologically inspired materials. But one broad idea keeps returning because it makes too much sense to ignore. Use what is already there. The Martian surface is covered in regolith, the layer of loose, dusty and rocky material that blankets much of the planet. If you want to build sustainably on Mars, you cannot rely forever on sending finished structures from Earth. You have to learn how to turn the local ground into part of the colony. That is why three-dimensional printing has attracted so much attention in discussions of Mars settlement. The logic is compelling. Rather than transporting fully built habitats at enormous expense, you transport the machines needed to process local material into structural forms. Regolith could be excavated, refined, mixed with water or binding agents, and then layered into thick walls or shells by autonomous printers. Instead of carrying buildings across interplanetary space, you carry the means to manufacture them on site. In practical terms, this may involve gathering regolith from the surrounding terrain, crushing or sifting it into a usable consistency, then combining it with water ice or other processed materials to create something structurally stable. The result would not necessarily resemble concrete exactly, but it would serve a similar purpose. Layer by layer, machines could create protective shells, vaults, berms, and reinforced enclosures that human settlers later pressurize and inhabit. On Earth, this would be an impressive engineering project. On Mars, it could become the default way a civilization begins. The reason thickness matters so much is radiation. Mars does not possess a global magnetic field like Earth's. Whatever such a shield once existed in the deep past, it no longer protects the planet in the way our magnetosphere protects us. The Martian atmosphere is also far too thin to do the heavy defensive work Earth's atmosphere does so naturally. The result is that the surface remains far more exposed to harmful radiation than any place humans have ever evolved to live. A thin-skinned inflatable module might keep pressure in, but on its own it would not be enough to provide the long-term shielding a colony needs. This is why so many habitat concepts include a final, unglamorous step after construction: bury it, or at least cover it heavily with additional regolith. Once a printed or assembled habitat stands in place, more Martian soil can be heaped over it to add a substantial protective layer. The image is almost humbling. After all the sophistication of interplanetary flight, the final answer to one of Mars's greatest dangers may partly resemble what animals on Earth have done for millions of years. seek shelter under the ground. That instinct extends naturally to caves and lava tubes as well. If a suitable subterranean space exists near the settlement site, it may become one of the most valuable natural assets in the colony's possession. A habitat placed inside or beneath such a feature would gain shielding almost for free, not because the danger disappears, but because the planet's own geology becomes part of the defence. But again, natural shelter introduces engineering challenges of its own. The cave must be stable, it must be reachable, its internal geometry must be mapped. It must not flood with dust, collapse, or present hidden thermal and structural problems that cannot be easily solved. Even nature's gifts on Mars arrive with conditions attached. Before permanent shelters are ready, the first settlers would probably have to live in something more temporary. They may remain in the spacecraft that brought them, at least initially, or occupy inflatable habitats carried from Earth. Such temporary structures could provide pressure, air, light, and a place to rest, but they would likely be small, cramped, and limited in protection compared with the colony's long-term dwellings. That means the first months on Mars would be awkward and transitional. The settlers might be physically present on the planet, but still psychologically suspended between expedition and settlement. And once the shell of a habitat exists, another transformation has to happen. An empty structure on Mars is not automatically usable simply because it stands there. It must be integrated into a working environmental system. That means power must be connected, internal spaces must be sealed, leaks must be tested, and the habitat must be pressurized with a breathable atmosphere. Here again, Mars refuses to let one problem remain one problem. Building shelter becomes chemistry. Chemistry becomes systems engineering. Oxygen is an essential part of that equation. A colony cannot depend forever on storing every breath in tanks brought from Earth. It must generate oxygen locally if it is to become anything more than an outpost living on borrowed time. One route is electrolysis, using electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. This has an appealing elegance to it. Water, once extracted, becomes not only drinking supply, but also raw material for life support. The oxygen can contribute to breathing mixtures. The hydrogen may then be stored, processed, or combined into fuel systems, depending on how advanced the settlement becomes. Nitrogen presents another challenge. Earth's atmosphere is rich in it, but Mars offers only traces compared with what humans are used to. A breathable indoor atmosphere would probably need a carefully engineered mix rather than pure oxygen, both for physiological reasons and for fire safety. That means gases may need to be extracted, stored, and managed in ways that remain stable over long periods. Air on Mars is not something you find, it is something you manufacture and then fight constantly to preserve. The good news is that air recycling is not science fiction. We already use versions of it in orbit. The bad news is that scaling such systems for a permanent settlement, far from immediate resupply and repair, is an altogether deeper problem. Filters clog, pumps fail, seals degrade, sensors drift. Small inefficiencies that would be annoying on Earth can become dangerous in a closed habitat. Over time, a colony's real success may depend less on dramatic moments of exploration and more on invisible reliability. On whether valves continue working, whether software remains trustworthy, whether spare parts were anticipated correctly months or years before they were needed. Power sits beneath all of this. A habitat on Mars is only as stable as the energy feeding it. Life support, heating, communications, excavation, water processing, oxygen production, lighting, computing, and future food systems all require electricity. Solar panels are useful, and in many regions of Mars they will likely be part of the solution. But relying on them alone would be risky, because dust accumulation and long dust storms can reduce output just when the colony can least afford it. That is why many settlement concepts imply some kind of hybrid system. Solar where possible, but backed by another dependable source able to carry the habitat through darkened weeks and system peaks. The truth is that a Martian home may never feel like a home in the ordinary Earth sense, at least not at first. It will feel like an engineered bubble of compensated normality, a place where temperature, air composition, humidity and pressure are continually corrected against a world that offers none of them naturally. Even the inside of the habitat will be a compromise. Space will be limited. Layout will be shaped by utility. Rooms may be multifunctional because every cubic meter must justify itself. Comfort will exist, but only after survival has been satisfied first. And yet there is something quietly profound about that. If human beings ever do make a lasting settlement on Mars, it will not begin with the luxury of spreading out into the landscape. It will begin with careful, deliberate enclosure. A tiny artificial pocket of Earth logic inserted into alien ground. The first true homes there may be half-buried, heavily shielded, compact, mechanically dependent, and still astonishing in what they represent. Not comfort, not mastery, but persistence. Because that is the deeper meaning of building shelter on Mars. You are not simply erecting walls. You are creating the first continuous argument that humans belong there long enough to stop merely visiting. Every printed layer of regolith, every sealed seam, every buried module, every recycled breath is a statement that the colony intends to continue, that it is not a camp, not a stunt, not a brief adventure before returning to a more forgiving planet. It is the first attempt to turn a hostile surface into a place where ordinary life can begin to happen. But even if that shelter works, even if the walls hold, the air remains breathable and the power stays on, a settlement still cannot truly function unless another set of workers has already done its part. Because Mars will demand scouting, inspection, mapping, hauling, repair, cave exploration, and dangerous movement far beyond what humans alone can safely manage. Which means that before the colony can really become resilient, it will need a second population living alongside it, one made not of settlers, but of machines. Those machines may prove just as important as the habitats themselves, because Mars is the kind of place where distance does not end at the interplanetary journey. It continues on the ground. Every ridge, crater wall, cave entrance, dust field, and buried deposit creates a second layer of remoteness that human beings cannot always cross safely or efficiently. If a colony is ever going to move beyond a fragile cluster of shelters and become something adaptable, it will need robotic partners able to go where people should not, or simply cannot, go first. We already have a sense of this from the rovers that have explored Mars. They changed our understanding of the planet precisely because they could endure places humans have never reached. They rolled across ancient lake beds, examined outcrops, drilled into rock, and lingered for years in an environment that would kill an unprotected person almost immediately. They taught us patience. They also taught us limitation. Traditional wheeled rovers, for all their success, are slow, very slow. They are excellent for certain kinds of careful exploration, but they are constrained by terrain, slope, rock distribution, wheel damage, power availability, and the simple fact that a machine built to avoid risk will not move through a dangerous landscape like a bold explorer. It will move like a cautious survivor. That is exactly what Mars forces every machine to become. A rover cannot take the kind of step a human might take over a small obstacle. It cannot squeeze past a narrowing in a cave passage if its chassis is too wide. It cannot easily recover from the wrong kind of slope or a patch of unstable ground. If the terrain becomes too rough, too sandy, too broken or too steep, the machine may simply stop being useful. On a world where many of the most scientifically and strategically interesting places are geologically messy, this matters a great deal. Consider caves. For a future colony, caves and lava tubes are among the most tantalizing features on Mars. They may preserve records of the planet's past far better than the surface does. They may protect evidence of ancient habitability. They may even hold clues about whether microbial life ever had a better chance below ground than it did under the exposed sky. And for settlers, they offer something just as valuable: shelter from radiation and from the daily assault of dust, micrometeorites, and thermal extremes. Yet caves are also one of the hardest environments to explore remotely. From orbit, we can sometimes identify openings, dark pits, skylights, suspicious voids in volcanic terrain. But an opening is not a map. It tells us almost nothing about what lies beyond the threshold. The tunnel may widen into a promising chamber, or tighten into a dead end. It may slope gently or drop sharply. It may fork unpredictably. The signal from a surface operator to a robot inside such a cave may also be blocked by rock very quickly, making direct control unreliable or impossible. On Mars, that means any machine sent underground must be able to make decisions for itself. This is where the next generation of robotic systems becomes so important. A colony will likely need machines with far greater autonomy than the rovers we tend to picture when we think of planetary exploration. Not because humans want to surrender control, but because physics and terrain will demand it. Communication lag with Earth already makes direct teleoperation difficult at the interplanetary level. Add local obstacles, blocked lines of sight, and the complexity of subterranean terrain, and the robot must be able to perceive, judge, and adapt in real time without waiting for instructions from anyone. That implies a different kind of machine, one equipped not just with cameras, but with the ability to construct a three-dimensional model of its surroundings as it moves. One capable of recognizing obstacles, selecting stable footholds or pathways, and revising its route when the expected terrain gives way to something worse. One able to identify points of interest and investigate them intelligently, rather than simply following pre-written commands. On Mars, autonomy is not a luxury feature. It is the difference between a useful scout and an expensive casualty. This is why legged robots have attracted so much interest in the context of planetary exploration. Wheels are elegant on flat ground, but Mars is not obliged to provide flat ground where it matters most. A robot with articulated legs can step over obstacles, adjust its gait, maintain balance on uneven terrain, and enter spaces that would defeat a larger wheeled platform. It can treat the ground less like a road and more like a set of moment-to-moment decisions. That is a subtle distinction, but on another world, it may be decisive. A walking machine also changes the geometry of exploration. It may be able to descend into awkward areas, navigate rubble, or move through narrow passages that would be inaccessible to a broad chassis. If it begins to slip, it can react dynamically. If it encounters a boulder field, it does not need a smooth path in the way a wheeled rover does. It only needs a sequence of survivable placements. That sounds almost obvious once said aloud, yet it represents a major shift in how exploration can happen. Mars may favour the robot that walks like an animal over the machine that rolls like a cart. And even that may not be enough on its own. The most resilient robotic presence on Mars may be a team, not a single device. One machine may map, another may haul, another may inspect confined spaces, another may remain as a communications relay between underground scouts and the surface settlement. Aerial systems may play a role too, where the thin atmosphere allows, especially for short reconnaissance hops over terrain that would take ground machines far longer to cross. The colony may begin to resemble a small ecosystem of specialized robots, each handling the kinds of mobility and risk humans would prefer not to endure directly. This has deep implications for settlement. The robots are not merely helpers, they are force multipliers for human survival. A human crew can only do so much outside in suits before exhaustion, danger, and simple time become limiting. A robot can continue longer, take greater exposure, revisit a hazardous zone repeatedly, and operate in temperatures or radiation conditions humans would rather avoid. It can inspect the outer walls of habitats after storms. It can clear accumulated dust. It can carry equipment from a landing area to a construction site. It can scout ahead of human traverses and reduce uncertainty before anyone commits their life to a route. Uncertainty is the key word here. The greatest value robots may provide is not just labour, but the conversion of unknowns into knowns. On Mars, unknowns are expensive. A slope that looks manageable from a distance may turn treacherous up close. A cave entrance may promise shelter, but conceal collapse risk. A patch of ground may appear firm until the weight of equipment sinks into it. A colony that sends humans first into every uncertainty will wear down its margins of safety very quickly. A colony that sends machines first preserves those margins. This is especially important during the expansion phase of settlement. It is one thing to survive inside a first cluster of habitats. It is another to grow beyond it. New water sources may need to be identified and verified. Local geology may need to be surveyed for useful minerals. Routes between infrastructure points may need to be established, maintained, and monitored. Equipment failures may occur far enough from the main base that sending humans immediately is risky. The settlement will only feel truly durable once it can project awareness and action outward, beyond the central habitat zone. Robots are the most plausible way to achieve that. There is also a scientific dimension that merges with the practical one. If Mars ever hosted life, even in microbial form, some of the best preserved traces may be below the surface or in protected geological niches. A robotic cave explorer could therefore advance both colonization and science simultaneously. It might identify a future shelter site while also searching for chemical or structural evidence of ancient water activity or sheltered ecosystems. In that sense, the machines helping us survive on Mars may also be the ones that finally answer one of the oldest questions that drew us there in the first place. And yet, the challenge is not just designing robots that can move well. It is designing robots that can fail gracefully. Mars is filled with ways to disable a machine. Dust infiltrates joints and seals. Cold stresses materials. Power is finite. Software can misjudge terrain. Communication can drop out. A useful robot for Mars cannot be one that performs beautifully only in perfect conditions. It must be one that remains valuable when conditions turn awkward, uncertain, and slightly wrong, because on Mars, slightly wrong is often the norm. That means repairability matters, modularity matters, redundancy matters. A colony may eventually need the ability to swap out damaged limbs, replace sensor packages, clean optical systems, and patch mobility systems locally rather than waiting for replacement units from Earth. The robot network of a Martian settlement cannot be treated as disposable. It would have to become part of the colony's maintained infrastructure, almost like a fleet of vehicles, tools, and co-workers all at once. This is one reason Mars colonization is often framed too narrowly in public imagination. We picture brave settlers in habitats, perhaps a greenhouse, perhaps a rover or two parked outside, and imagine the essential drama belongs to the people. But the settlement that survives will probably be the one that surrounds those people with layers of robotic capability. The machines will carry part of the burden of exploration, inspection, transport, construction, and risk. The humans may remain the decision makers, but their decisions will increasingly depend on what their robotic counterparts have already seen, measured, and endured. Over time, the boundary between colony and machine network may even begin to blur. A habitat protected by robots, supplied by robots, expanded by robots, and informed by robotic survey is not just assisted by automation, it is structurally intertwined with it. Human life on Mars may therefore never look like a simple transplant of a town from Earth. It may look more like a cooperative system in which biological and mechanical workers depend on one another in different ways. And that raises a quietly profound possibility. Perhaps the first true Martian society will not begin when enough humans arrive. Perhaps it will begin when the planet hosts a functioning web of habitats, power systems, processing units, and mobile machines that together create a stable envelope for human life. In that world, a robot inspecting a cave wall or carrying supplies through dust is not a side character in the story of colonization. It is part of the colony's nervous system. But even the most capable machines cannot solve everything. They can scout for water, help build shelter, inspect hazards, and open paths into terrain people fear to enter. Yet at some point, the settlement has to answer a more intimate question. Once the walls are standing and the machines are working, how do human beings actually stay alive there day after day? Because no colony is real until it can feed itself, recycle its waste, and turn toxic Martian ground into the beginning of a sustainable human routine. That is where colonization stops looking like a spectacular engineering feat and starts looking like a daily metabolic problem. A settlement can land, survive a storm, even erect protective habitats, and still fail if it cannot sustain the ordinary processes that keep bodies and minds alive. In the long run, a Martian colony is not judged by whether humans can arrive there. It is judged by whether they can wake up there 10,000 mornings in a row without every breakfast, every breath, and every glass of water depending on a launch from Earth. Food sits at the centre of that challenge. It is not enough to store a large supply and hope it lasts. The larger and more permanent the settlement becomes, the more brutally impractical total dependence on imported food would be. Every kilogram launched from Earth costs money, fuel, planning, and risk. A colony that remains nutritionally tethered to Earth forever is not truly a colony. It is a remote camp waiting to become unaffordable. Sooner or later, Mars has to feed the people living on it, at least in part. This is why the question of Martian soil matters so much, though even here the language can mislead us. What covers much of Mars is more accurately called regolith, rather than soil in the rich, earthly sense. Earth soil is alive with history. It has been churned by roots, fungi, microbes, worms, insects, weather, and the slow recycling of generations of dead organisms. Martian regolith has no such biological memory. It is ground material, geologically processed but not biologically matured. That does not make it useless, but it does mean Mars offers a growing medium very different from the one terrestrial agriculture evolved around. Even so, there is cautious reason for optimism. Analogues and experiments on Earth suggest that simulated Martian soil can support some plant growth if handled properly. Many of the essential mineral nutrients plants need do exist in Martian material, though not always in ideal balance, and certainly not in a form ready for effortless farming. Different regions of Mars would almost certainly vary in quality, just as different regions of Earth do. Some areas would be relatively more favourable, others might be deeply poor growing environments. So the colony would need more than a simple assumption that plants can grow in Martian dirt. It would need local testing, ongoing amendment, and a far more controlled agricultural system than open field farming has ever required. One of the most immediate problems is structure. Martian regolith lacks the organic content that helps Earth soils retain moisture, support microbial ecosystems, and maintain a healthy balance of aeration and texture around roots. Without organic material, water movement through the medium may be poor, compaction may become an issue, and the biological processes many plants quietly depend on would be largely absent. In other words, even if the minerals are present, the medium itself is not automatically hospitable. The colony would have to make it so. That likely means adding organic matter. Compost from food waste, plant remains, and processed biological waste from the colonists themselves could gradually transform raw regolith into something more suitable for repeated cultivation. This is one of those unglamorous truths that future Martian life would have to accept very quickly. Waste does not remain waste for long in a closed settlement. It becomes feedstock. Nutrients taken into the human body must eventually return to the agricultural cycle in some sanitized and carefully managed form, or the system steadily bleeds fertility and becomes more dependent on imports. The mention of human waste may sound unpleasant, but in a colony it becomes deeply practical. On Earth, we often have the luxury of separating comfort from biological reality. On Mars, closed-loop life support will constantly push them back together. Properly processed waste can become fertilizer, dead plant material can become compost, water can be recovered, carbon can be reused through biological systems. The settlement survives not by keeping itself pristine in the suburban sense, but by becoming metabolically clever. Yet fertility is not the only obstacle. Martian regolith also contains substances that pose more direct chemical danger. Heavy metals may be present in problematic amounts, but one of the most concerning issues is the presence of perchlorates. These salts are toxic in sufficiently large concentrations and can be harmful both to plants and to the people who might eventually eat anything grown in contaminated material. This changes the agricultural question from, can plants grow there, to, can food grown there be made safe? There are several possible ways to address this. One is washing the regolith, running water through it to dissolve and remove perchlorates before the material is used for planting. That sounds simple, but like everything on Mars, it comes with system-wide consequences. Water is precious. Any washing method would need to be efficient and recover as much water as possible afterward. The removed chemicals would also have to go somewhere. In a colony designed around minimizing waste, even toxic compounds might eventually become industrial feedstocks if processes exist to separate and use them safely. Mars has a way of turning every solution into another engineering discipline. Another possibility involves biology. Certain microbes can metabolize perchlorates, breaking them down, and in the process releasing products more useful than the original contaminants. If such systems can be integrated safely into agricultural preparation, biology might help soften one of the harshest chemical edges of Martian regolith. That would be fitting in a way. A planet once thought of only in geological and mechanical terms would begin to be prepared for human life, not just with machines, but with carefully chosen living systems. Still, it may be unwise for a colony to rely entirely on regolith-based farming at first. More likely, Martian agriculture would be hybrid. Hydroponic or aquaponic systems may handle a large share of early food production because they allow much more precise control over nutrients, water use, contamination, and plant health. Regolith-based cultivation might then develop alongside them, gradually becoming more important as treatment methods improve and local knowledge accumulates. This would also provide resilience. If one agricultural approach suffered disease, chemical imbalance, or mechanical failure, another might continue operating. That redundancy matters because growing food on Mars is not simply about calories. Fresh food has broader value. It provides vitamins and antioxidants that may become especially important in a stressful and radiation-exposed environment. It also helps psychologically. A colony living entirely on preserved, rehydrated, and repetitive food may remain alive, but over time, morale would almost certainly erode. Fresh leaves, real textures, colour, smell, and the quiet routine of tending living plants could become emotionally important in ways easy to underestimate from Earth. Human beings do not eat only with their stomachs. We eat with memory, culture, comfort, and rhythm. A greenhouse on Mars might therefore serve as more than a nutritional asset. It may become one of the first spaces in the colony that feels less like a machine and more like a piece of life. A place where humidity rises, where green interrupts the hard geometry of metal and regolith, where growth continues visibly from day to day. That could matter deeply in a settlement otherwise defined by sealed walls, recycled air, and relentless caution. But agriculture on Mars would not be passive. Plants need light, water, nutrients, pest management, temperature control, and daily oversight. Artificial lighting in particular could become a major energy burden if natural sunlight is insufficient or too inconsistent due to dust and habitat design. So even food production loops back to the colony's energy problem. The greenhouse is not just a farm. It is another power-hungry organ in the body of the settlement. And once again, the challenge broadens from chemistry and biology into human routine. Someone has to tend the crops. Someone has to monitor disease, prune growth, maintain nutrient balance, harvest food, process waste, clean filters, and decide what gets planted next. Mars farming may eventually become efficient, but it will never be effortless. A colony's workday could be filled with chores that seem mundane in description, but are existential in consequence. On Earth, if a few plants fail, it is disappointing. On Mars, a failed crop could narrow the colony's margin for error far more sharply. All of this points toward a larger truth. The colony will only become durable if it learns to think like an ecosystem. Not a static base, but a living circulation of matter and energy. Water recovered from waste feeds life support and agriculture. Plant growth supports food and psychological health. Compost returns nutrients to growing systems. Air is scrubbed, restored, and recirculated. Heat is managed. Materials are reused. Every output is examined for possible reintegration, because there are too many penalties attached to treating anything as disposable. That closed-loop logic extends into everyday life beyond food. Clothing may need to be repaired rather than replaced casually. Broken equipment may be cannibalized for parts. Containers may be reused repeatedly. Dust must be kept from infiltrating seals, filters, machinery, and lungs. Simple cleanliness becomes a systems issue. Hygiene is not just about comfort. It helps manage illness, contamination, and equipment longevity. In a Mars colony, maintenance becomes a lifestyle. This leads into the least discussed but perhaps most persistent burden of all: psychology. Even if the colony solves food, water, shelter, and energy well enough to remain alive, it still has to remain livable. The settlers would inhabit confined spaces for long periods. They would see the same walls, the same people, the same horizon outside. Their excursions beyond the habitat would require preparation and caution. Their work would often be repetitive and mission-critical. Even leisure would be shaped by limitation. There is no easy walk into open air, no spontaneous drive through a different town, no weather you can simply enjoy on your skin. We have some analogues on Earth: scientists stationed in Antarctica, crews on submarines, isolated workers in remote installations. These environments teach us that confinement and monotony are not soft problems. They can fray concentration, intensify conflict, distort emotion, and erode motivation. But Mars adds a harder edge. People in those Earth environments know, however distantly, that they remain on their home world. Mars settlers would know that immediate return may be impossible, or at least profoundly difficult. The surrounding landscape would not merely be remote, it would be absolutely unusable without technological mediation. That means future colonists will need more than technical competence. They will need emotional endurance, the ability to live with repetition, to handle tension among the same small group of people, to continue performing under a constant background awareness of risk. This is one reason the colony cannot be judged only by hardware. Its designers would also need to think about beauty, privacy, habitability, recreation, and social structure. A settlement built like a mere bunker might keep people alive for a while. It may not keep them well. Fresh food, green spaces, routines of shared work, meaningful personal space, communication with loved ones back on Earth even with delays, and rituals that mark time may all become surprisingly important. In the abstract, these can sound secondary, even indulgent. In reality, they may be part of the life support system in a broader human sense. A colony that ignores them may discover that psychological brittleness can be just as dangerous as mechanical brittleness. And there is another layer still waiting behind all of this. The human body itself may not tolerate long Martian living as cleanly as our hopes suggest. Even after the journey, even with food and shelter and exercise and carefully managed routines, Mars still offers lower gravity, chronic radiation exposure, and an environment unlike anything in our evolutionary past. The settlement may eventually learn how to feed people there and keep them emotionally steady, but that does not settle the final, uncomfortable question of whether unmodified human biology is truly enough for permanent life on another world. That question takes us to the deepest barrier of all, because by the time a colony can travel to Mars, choose a site, build shelter, deploy machines, recycle water, and grow food, it may still run into a limit far older than any technology. The human body was shaped by Earth. Every organ, every tissue, every reflex, every developmental rhythm emerged under one atmosphere, one gravity field, one magnetic shield, and one very specific biological history. Mars does not offer any of those in the form we know. Low gravity is one of the first ways this mismatch becomes visible. Mars does have gravity, which makes it a very different environment from deep space, but it is still much weaker than Earth's. That sounds like a manageable difference at first. After all, some gravity must be better than none, and perhaps it is. But the truth is, we do not yet know what the human body would become after years or generations under Martian gravity. We know enough from spaceflight to be concerned. Bone density declines when gravity is removed. Muscles waste without constant resistance. Fluid distribution changes. Balance systems adapt in ways that can become problematic. The cardiovascular system, tuned for Earth, begins to behave differently. Even vision can be affected. The hopeful assumption is that Mars, with its partial gravity, would reduce many of these problems compared with orbital weightlessness. But reduced is not the same as solved. A human being might be able to live there for a while with exercise, medicine, and good care. That does not tell us what happens after decades. It does not tell us what happens to children born there, growing through every stage of development in a weaker gravitational field than the one that shaped our skeletons, circulation, and nervous systems over evolutionary time. A colony that hopes to become permanent must eventually confront not just how adults survive on Mars, but how a human life cycle behaves there from beginning to end. Radiation makes this uncertainty even sharper. On the journey to Mars, it is already dangerous. On the surface, it remains a persistent threat because Mars lacks the kind of global magnetic shielding Earth provides. Habitats can be buried, walls can be thickened, time outdoors can be limited, but complete avoidance is unlikely. Settlers would still accumulate exposure over months and years. The more active the colony becomes, the more maintenance, exploration and construction demand time beyond the shelter of the habitat. And unlike many ordinary risks, radiation damage does not always announce itself when it happens. It accumulates quietly, folding long-term uncertainty into everyday life. This is what makes the Mars question so unsettling. It is not just, can we get there? It becomes, can we remain biologically stable there without slowly paying a price that only becomes clear later? A mission can succeed and still reveal a deeper incompatibility. A settlement can function and still be eroding its inhabitants in ways hard to measure in real time. The human body is resilient, but resilience is not the same as immunity. That is why some researchers and futurists have gone further than habitat design and exercise regimens. They have suggested that long-duration settlement beyond Earth may eventually require changing not the environment alone, but ourselves. That is a disturbing thought to many people, and understandably so. It cuts against one of our most comforting intuitions, which is that the challenge lies purely in building better machines. But if biology remains the bottleneck, then engineering may one day turn inward. The first version of that inward turn is not as fantastical as it sounds. Medicine already alters human outcomes constantly. We vaccinate, transplant, repair, replace, and intervene. Gene-based therapies are no longer science fiction. Technologies such as CRISPR have already shown that DNA can, in principle, be edited with extraordinary precision. Today, such work is still surrounded by technical difficulty, ethical concern, and intense caution, especially when it comes to heritable changes. But the conceptual barrier has already been crossed. Human biology is no longer untouchable in the way it once seemed. On Mars, that possibility becomes less abstract. If radiation remains one of the greatest long-term dangers, then naturally scientists begin looking for biological strategies used elsewhere in nature. Some organisms on Earth show astonishing resistance to radiation damage. Certain microbes can endure doses that would devastate human tissue. Tardigrades have become famous for their durability in extreme conditions. The mechanisms behind such resilience are not magical. They involve ways of protecting, repairing, or stabilizing genetic material and cellular structures under stress. If some of those protective strategies can be understood deeply enough, it is not hard to imagine people asking whether they might one day be adapted for human benefit. At first, this might take the form of therapies rather than permanent redesign, better DNA repair enhancement, drugs that reduce radiation damage, biological treatments that improve resistance to oxidative stress or cellular breakdown. In that form, the ethical picture feels closer to medicine as we already know it. But the farther we push settlement away from Earth, the harder it may become to keep the question confined to temporary treatment. If children are to be born on Mars, if people are to live their entire lives there, if exposure and reduced gravity remain chronic facts rather than brief mission conditions, then some will inevitably argue that deeper biological adaptation is the honest answer. That is where the boundary becomes uncomfortable. At what point does protecting human beings in a hostile environment become redesigning them for that environment? And if such redesign ever happens, are we still talking about ordinary human settlement, or the beginning of a branch in our own species shaped by a different world? The language may sound dramatic, but the logic is straightforward. Evolution on Earth always followed environment. If we try to create a long-term population on Mars, then either Earth-evolved biology must be constantly compensated by technology, or biology itself must begin to shift in response to Martian conditions, whether by natural selection, deliberate intervention, or some combination of the two. Natural selection alone would be painfully slow and ethically impossible to treat casually. No humane civilization would willingly expose generations to elevated risk simply to see what adaptation emerges. That leaves deliberate intervention as the more likely road if the problem becomes urgent enough. But deliberate intervention brings a burden of its own. Who decides which traits are acceptable to modify? What counts as therapy and what counts as enhancement? Would changes be restricted to protecting health? Or would people begin arguing for broader optimization suited to life on Mars? Stronger bones under lower gravity, better radiation repair, altered metabolism, changed development patterns. Once the door opens, even a little, it becomes difficult to say where necessity ends and ambition begins. This is why Mars colonization may one day force ethical debates more profound than the engineering debates that usually dominate public discussion. Rockets, habitats, and reactors are technical questions. Human redesign is civilizational. It reaches into law, identity, inheritance, consent, and the meaning of parenthood. A settlement on Mars is no longer just about where we live. It becomes about what kind of descendants we are willing to create in order to live there at all. Some people would reject this entire line of thinking and insist that humanity should adapt Mars to itself rather than adapt itself to Mars. There is power in that argument. It preserves continuity with what we already are. It says the proper task of technology is to protect the human form, not rewrite it. But that path also has limits. Total environmental control is expensive. Shielding has mass. Artificial gravity, if attempted at scale, adds complexity. Sealed habitats can fail. Closed systems require endless maintenance. The farther a settlement expands, the more difficult it becomes to keep every square meter feeling like Earth. This tension may define the future of interplanetary civilization. Do we carry Earth with us forever, building thicker shells and more elaborate support systems around bodies that never truly belong to the new world? Or do we begin, cautiously and controversially, to make those bodies more compatible with where we are going? Neither answer is emotionally easy. One preserves our inheritance but may keep us permanently dependent on technological cocoons. The other may increase our long-term resilience, but asks us to interfere with the deepest architecture of ourselves. And Mars is only the beginning. If the human body struggles there, what does that imply for more distant destinations? The outer solar system is colder, darker, and in many ways even less forgiving. Travel times are longer, communication delays are worse. Radiation exposure during transit accumulates over greater spans. If Mars already pushes the limits of unmodified human settlement, then it may serve as a kind of threshold test for the entire interplanetary future. A civilization that cannot solve Mars in biological as well as mechanical terms may discover that its expansion stops much sooner than its imagination hoped. That may be why Mars matters so much beyond its own geography. It is not merely another world to land on. It is the first place where we may have to decide whether being a multiplanetary species means carrying human beings outward unchanged, or allowing the act of expansion to alter what human beings are. The romance of colonization often hides that possibility beneath images of rockets and red horizons, but the deepest transformation may not happen in the sky or in the soil. It may happen in the genome, in the clinic, in the choices parents and societies make under the pressure of survival. And that brings us back to the title question in a more honest form. What is actually preventing us from colonizing Mars? It is not a single machine we have failed to build, nor a single discovery we have failed to make. It is a chain of barriers, each connected to the next, all culminating in one final uncertainty. Even if we solve the transport problem, the shelter problem, the food problem, the energy problem, and the autonomy problem, we may still discover that the last barrier is the simple fact that Earth made us for Earth. And once you see the problem that way, the whole picture sharpens. Mars is not being kept from us by one missing invention or one delayed launch vehicle. It is being kept from us by a web of limits that interact with each other so tightly that solving one often makes another more difficult. The dream survives because no single barrier is absolute. The dream remains unrealized because all of them exist at once. Distance is the first of those barriers, but only in the most literal sense. Mars is far enough away that the journey becomes its own dangerous environment, long enough that crews must absorb radiation, confinement, delay, and physiological decline before they ever touch the ground. That distance then shapes everything else. It demands autonomy. It punishes inefficiency. It turns every spare part, every kilogram of shielding, every litre of water, and every medical contingency into something that must be thought through in advance. The colony cannot rely on quick rescue, quick consultation, or casual replacement. The farther away a settlement is, the more complete its internal logic has to be. Then Mars itself takes over. The landing site must balance water access, terrain, sunlight, elevation, shelter possibilities, and long-term expandability. The habitat must not merely stand, it must keep a breathable atmosphere inside while holding radiation, dust, and thermal stress outside. Power must remain available even during storms that dim the sky. Water must be recovered and reused. Food must be grown in systems that are at once biological and industrial. Robots must widen the reach of the colony because humans alone cannot safely inspect, map, build, and maintain enough of the surrounding environment to keep the settlement robust. And over all of this hangs the stubborn fact of human biology. Our bodies weaken in low gravity. Our tissues absorb radiation damage. Our psychology strains under isolation and confinement. Even when the engineering works, the organism still carries Earth inside it, expecting a world Mars does not provide. That is why the phrase colonizing Mars can be misleading when spoken too casually. It suggests a straightforward extension of something humanity has done before. In truth, Mars is not another frontier in the old sense. It is a test of whether civilization can recreate the conditions of life, almost from first principles, on a planet that offers only fragments of what we need. Yet none of this means the project is impossible. In fact, what makes Mars so compelling is precisely that it lies in the narrow band between absurdity and plausibility. Venus asks too much of us in heat and pressure. The outer planets offer no solid ground to claim. Many moons are colder, darker, and in some ways even less accommodating. Mars, by contrast, gives us just enough to work with. Water in ice, gravity that, while insufficient, is at least present, a day length close to our own, surface conditions brutal but not instantly unsurvivable behind proper protection. If there is a place in the solar system where human settlement can first move beyond temporary visitation, Mars remains the strongest candidate. That is one reason private industry has become so interested in it. Sending human beings to Mars requires a transportation system capable not just of one symbolic mission, but of repeated heavy delivery. Cargo, life support systems, construction tools, habitat components, power units, spare parts, scientific equipment, and eventually people must all be moved there in meaningful quantities. This is not the kind of logistical burden a single heroic launch can solve. It requires a cadence, a transport architecture, something closer to an interplanetary supply chain than a single expedition. That is where the appeal of very large, reusable rockets enters the conversation. If a launch vehicle can carry massive payloads and be flown repeatedly rather than discarded after one use, the cost structure of space travel changes. It may not change enough to make Mars easy, but it can move the problem from the realm of almost purely symbolic missions towards something more industrial. This is why companies developing fully reusable heavy-lift vehicles have shaped the conversation so much. They are not solving colonization by themselves, but without cheaper and more frequent transport, the rest of the colony never gets enough mass delivered to begin scaling. And even if that transport system matures, Mars still retains one more way of reminding us that it is not waiting to be inhabited. Dust storms. They are among the clearest symbols of the planet's indifference because they expose how one Martian fact can ripple through every layer of a settlement at once. A global or near-global storm does not need to tear habitats apart to be dangerous. It only needs to reduce sunlight, blanket equipment in fine dust, complicate movement, and stretch power reserves. Solar arrays lose efficiency. Exterior maintenance becomes harder. Visibility drops. Temperature management shifts. Communication equipment may need more cleaning and oversight. The colony becomes more inward-looking at precisely the moment it most needs resilience. What makes these storms so revealing is that they condense the whole Martian challenge into one event. Energy becomes scarce, machines become strained, human activity narrows, stored resources matter more. Design choices made months or years earlier suddenly reveal whether they were wise. A colony that depends too heavily on a single power source, a single transport loop, or a single fragile chain of assumptions may survive many calm months, only to discover during a storm that redundancy was never a luxury. It was the real architecture of survival all along. This is why the honest answer to what is preventing us from colonizing Mars sounds less like a headline and more like a systems diagram. We are not blocked by one thing. We are blocked by transportation costs, radiation exposure, closed-loop life support demands, slow communication, construction difficulty, environmental uncertainty, power fragility, agricultural complexity, human psychological strain, and biological incompatibility with long-term extraterrestrial living. Each of those is serious. Together they form something more formidable than a single impossibility. They form a threshold. To cross it, we do not need one breakthrough, we need many, and they must work together. Still, thresholds are crossed by civilizations all the time. Not because they become lucky, but because enough smaller advances accumulate and begin reinforcing one another. Better rockets make heavier shielding and more infrastructure plausible. Better robotics makes site preparation and maintenance more feasible. Better life support reduces dependency on resupply. Better medicine broadens what the human body can tolerate. Better power systems weaken the threat posed by dust and darkness. Better materials improve habitats. Better autonomy makes delayed communication less crippling. Step by step, the impossible sometimes becomes merely difficult, and then, eventually, normal. Mars may follow that pattern. If it does, the first lasting settlement will probably look much less dramatic than our popular imagination expects. It may begin as a handful of protected modules, half buried in regolith, surrounded by machines, living cautiously on recycled air and carefully budgeted power. It may feel less like the founding of a gleaming new civilization and more like a remote industrial outpost that happens to sit on another planet. That would not diminish the achievement. It would make it more real. Civilization rarely begins in grandeur. More often, it begins in persistence. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson Mars offers us. The obstacle is not just technological, it is philosophical. Colonizing Mars would require humanity to become better at long-term thinking than it usually is. Better at maintaining systems rather than celebrating moments. Better at redundancy, restraint, planning, and interdependence. Better at accepting that survival in a hostile place is not secured by boldness alone, but by endless maintenance, humility before the environment, and a willingness to build patiently rather than theatrically. If we ever do live on Mars, that life will not be sustained by romance. It will be sustained by filtration systems, recycled water, carefully tended crops, dust-resistant seals, autonomous machines, medical discipline, and choices made by people willing to trade heroic myths for operational reality. And yet, there is something inspiring in that too. Not because it is glamorous, but because it asks a more mature question of our species. Not, can we visit another world? But, can we endure on one without lying to ourselves about what endurance costs? So what is actually preventing us from colonizing Mars? For now, it is the fact that the red planet demands almost everything at once. It demands transport on a scale we are only beginning to approach. It demands shielding from dangers we still struggle to mitigate fully. It demands habitats that function like artificial organs. It demands food systems, power systems, and machine networks that can survive interruption. It demands people able to withstand isolation, risk, and routine. And in the end, it may even demand that we decide whether remaining exactly as we are is compatible with becoming a species that truly lives beyond Earth. Mars is not impossible. That is what keeps the dream alive. But it is not forgiving either. To settle there, we would have to solve so many linked problems that by the time we succeed, the greater question may no longer be whether humanity managed to colonize Mars. It may be what kind of humanity had to emerge in order to do it.